They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
5 times in U.S. history, the candidate elected to be president was not the person chosen by the majority of its citizens. Each time that happened, there were accusations of fraud, interference, or a system rigged against the people. At the root of the discrepancy is the Electoral College, one of the least understood processes in U.S. government, yet it lies at the heart of our representative democracy.
We are the only democratic country, I believe, in the world that elects its chief executive officer by something other than one person, one vote. It's really outrageous.
You can have instances like we saw in this last election and in other elections before where most people might not vote for someone, but the electoral college comes out and votes for that person more than the general population. So you'll see people with, less than 50% of the vote actually win.
I think in many ways it disenfranchises a lot of youth from voting, and the Electoral College in general tends to be a confusing process for a lot of young people who don't take the time to learn how the institution came to be and why it's still around today.
It alienates a big chunk of the population who says, you know what, my candidate won. The people voted my candidate in, and yet this system that was developed when, hundreds of years ago is making it so this guy's president who the people didn't vote for.
The system has allowed candidates who lost a popular vote to be elected to office in 1824, 1876, 1888, more recently in 2000 when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush, and in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump.
I think what's frustrating is many Americans don't understand that. Many Americans say, well, if you got the most votes nationally, then it would be nothing but right that you be president of the United States.
I have an MBA, so I have a graduate degree, and I barely understand it.
I feel like this is stuff I learned in high school or at some point in my life, but once again, just because voting's seen as some negative thing, I've just kind of not retained a lot of that information.
How did the Electoral College come into existence? Why are they here?
When the Constitution was written, the convention showed up not to write a new Constitution, but to figure out how they could take the Articles of Confederation and deal with the problem of the Revolutionary War debt, because they didn't have the power to tax except by state.
At that time, several states, Pennsylvania, New York, were putting up tariffs against the other states, and they wanted to form their own little country. And other states said, well, we're going to have a country that will keep them from getting too much power. When George Washington was asked to preside over the Constitutional Convention, he said, I know the position of the small states. They're going to insist on equal representation in the Congress. That was the right they held under the Articles of Confederation. And I also know that the big states are going to absolutely insist that their representation in Congress be based purely on population. And the southern states want the slaves to be counted so that they could have greater representation in Congress and thereby be able to preserve slavery in the South. But somebody came forward and said, why don't we compromise and we'll do both? We'll have a House where each state is represented equally. We'll call that the Senate. And we'll have another house, we'll just call it the House of Representatives, based on population.
How the president is chosen was one of the last things that was done in the Constitutional Convention. The grand compromise in terms of how the Senate and how representation was going to be done was struck on July 7th. The final decision about how we were going to elect the president was in September. They actually went through, I believe, 11 different proposals, one of which was direct election, which lost, by the way, by 1 vote. And this idea of an electoral college, like a college of cardinals, basically as sort of like punting in a way, because they couldn't get to an agreement as to how the president should be elected.
The Electoral College is a group of people appointed by the legislature of each state that vote for president for us. The Constitution gives citizens no right to vote for president. Only electors are allowed to cast direct votes for president. Many people today wonder why that is.
Well, the purpose of electors, they were meant to be kind of the wise statesmen of the time. And they were worried with such a young nation that if it was going to be a direct election, the passions of the people, the passions of the masses could end up possibly electing somebody president that shouldn't be president in their eyes.
They wanted to make sure that someone couldn't take office simply because they were really popular in a few states. And so they wanted someone who had support across a number of states.
The way that Alexander Hamilton had perceived the Electoral College to work was that electors would be selected from each state, and then those electors would convene and discuss amongst themselves who they thought would be the best candidate for president. And those electors would be held to account for making sure that whomever they voted for was not indebted to a foreign country, was qualified, was of good moral character.
They couldn't really decide on how electors were going to be chosen by the states. Madison, Hamilton, they always had some kind of different ideas. And it was getting kind of late, September, October of the year in which the Constitutional Convention met. And they said, we're never going to really agree on this. Why don't we just leave it to each state to determine the role of electors? And each state can decide.
So how do you become a part of the Electoral College? Do you have to have other experiences, or who votes for them?
Prior to 1876, some states said, we'll allow the legislature to vote and pick the electors. But by 1876, up until the present, every state has said, we're going to allow the people of our state to determine who the electors are.
I think that the Electoral College probably does not work in the way that the framers of the Constitution anticipated. And by that I mean that they truly believed that the names of electors would be on the ballot.
Possibly there may be some southern states that still list the electors on the ballot, but people don't know.
You as a voter in Colorado will never see those names. Colorado law simply lists the candidates for president and vice president.
I think that the Electoral College made sense when the founding fathers were putting it together, but now, unfortunately, it benefits some states more than others, and we can end up in a situation like we've been in a couple of times in my lifetime, where the popular vote went one way and the Electoral College went the other. And I feel like we've reached a point now where we should be able to say popular vote is the answer when it comes to presidential elections.
To me, it's a beautiful thing. It was a grand compromise by the framers of the Constitution to account for these competing interests of very populous states, less populous states, to bring them together in the United States.
I really believe in the concept of one person, one vote. And I think that everybody's vote should matter. Everybody's vote should be equal. And that should be regardless of where the voter lives. Right now, I don't think anyone can say that is really the case.
There needs to be a change in the way we elect our presidents.
Citizens have been clamoring for change, and particularly right after presidential elections that go the wrong way. The challenge is so few people actually really understand how the winner-take-all rule works, and people think that the problem is the Electoral College, when really the problem is how we award electors.
How does our electoral system allow election outcomes to differ from the popular vote? Is there something sneaky and underhanded going on? And if it only happens in close elections, is it really that big a deal?
How it works today is in 48 states, it's called the winner-take-all rule. So whoever has the most votes in that state, you get all the electors from that state.
Over the course of time, the state legislatures, with the exception of two, have adopted a winner-take-all system. I think the question of whether a state does that or not is a pretty legitimate one, particularly in this day and age.
There's nothing in the Constitution that says that we need to have a winner-take-all system, for example, even though 48 out of our 50 states currently have that. It really goes back to what happened in our 1800 election, where Thomas Jefferson wanted to have the majority of electors in Virginia, in his home state, vote for him. And he prevailed upon the Virginia legislature to change their system to a winner-take-all. Many states followed suit, and by our 11th presidential election, the majority of our states actually had a winner-take-all system. But that's not mandated by the Constitution. In fact, the founders were very smart in making sure that the states would have the ability to allocate electors in a different way or whatever way they saw fit.
You change the electoral map in a lot of ways if you simply said as a state that you were going to award your electoral votes by congressional district for those electors, and then the two by how the state went overall.
Allocating each state's electoral votes by district comes closer to one person, one vote outcome, but it's subject to political manipulation through a practice called gerrymandering. The name is taken from Elbridge Gerry, a former governor of Massachusetts who in 1812 allowed a state senate district to be drawn in a shape that a cartoonist at the time compared to a salamander. When district boundaries are drawn in such bizarre shapes, they can sway election outcomes to favor one political party over another. Here's a simple example. Let's say there are 100 voters in a state, grouped into 10 congressional districts of equal population. Here, the Democrat voters in blue outnumber the red Republican voters in 6 out of 10 districts. But if the boundary lines of the 10 voting districts are redrawn to cluster Democrat voters into fewer districts, or to split them across majority Republican districts, the voting results are reversed. With the new boundaries, Republicans win in 6 out of 10 districts, even though the number of voters for each party hasn't changed. In fact, with 54 blue votes for Democrats and 46 red votes for Republicans, the new boundaries have resulted in an election outcome that is the exact opposite of the popular vote. This isn't just a hypothetical example. Michigan's 14th congressional district and Maryland's 3rd congressional district are just 2 of the many examples of partisan gerrymandering across the United States today, implemented by both Democratic and Republican state legislatures. And a 2019 Supreme Court ruling said that it's up to the state legislatures to stop political gerrymandering. That requires us to vote in local elections for legislators who will take action to stop it.
And that is directly opposite of what a democracy should do, which should reflect the will of the people and not the will of a party.
If you go to a congressional district method, you're essentially moving from battleground states to battleground districts. Battleground states are those states that you know that the election is going to be very close. If you're a state that's reliably red or a state that's reliably blue, there's no reason for a presidential campaign to spend money there. So there's no reason for a presidential candidate to go to California. There's no reason for a presidential candidate to go to Washington State. What matters are battleground states like Colorado, Virginia, Florida, and what that ends up doing is that skews public policy decisions. President Obama signed the recovery bill for banks and the economic system in Colorado. He signed 3 different pieces of legislation in Colorado.
Trump hardly campaigned at all in New York or California. He just kind of wrote those off. And so he emphasized the states in which he had a chance.
President Obama didn't show up on the shores of the Gulf after the Gulf disaster, the BP rig that blew up, not until oil hit the shores of Florida. Now keep in mind, oil was hitting the shores of all those other states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, but those aren't battleground states. President George W. Bush did steel tariffs. Why did he do steel tariffs? Because of Pennsylvania. So again, the winner-take-all rule skews public policy decisions.
Why isn't the popular vote more essential? Why hasn't the Electoral College changed by now?
It takes a constitutional change, and that's very difficult to achieve. You have to get a majority of the states approving the constitutional change. We don't do that very often.
The Electoral College is written into the U.S. Constitution at Article 2, Section 1. It says, Each state is entitled to the same number of electors as they have representation in both houses of Congress. No congressperson or federal official can be an elector, and it's explicitly stated that each state legislature can appoint their electors however they want. All electors must be appointed on the same day. The Constitution requires the electors to meet in their respective states on the same day to vote for president and vice president. One of the people the electors vote for has to be from another state. The election becomes official when the votes are counted in a joint session of Congress. Beyond that, the Constitution only specifies what happens after the votes are counted. Because the Constitution doesn't specify, states allow political parties to choose their own electors. Today's electors are already pledged to vote for their party's candidate, and each state's legislature has their own election rules about which electors will vote. Maine and Nebraska currently allocate electors according to their state's popular vote. The rest of the states send only electors pledged to their state's winning candidate. In other words, winner take all.
There was a movement in the 60s and 70s, many times led by Senator Bayh, in order to go to direct election of the president.
I think it's fair to say that we have a better chance today to get this revision in our electoral process than we've ever had before. I think most people are aware that the present system is dangerous, it's outdated, it's archaic, it's one that needs to be revised and made responsive to the needs of today's electoral problems. In my judgment, reform should meet a three-point criteria. I think the people should be personally involved. I think everybody's vote should count the same. And I think in the final analysis, the man who wins is the man who gets the most votes. And there's only one proposal, that's the one that I've made, that's been endorsed by the Bar Association, the Chamber of Commerce, all the labor organizations. That let the people directly vote for their president the same way they vote for all other officials.
You actually had, presidents supporting it. Richard Nixon at the time was supporting it. But the challenge that you have, and it's the same kind of challenge you're going to have today, is that there are certain regions of the country, certain states that benefit from the current system. And there was a worry from the South, and this is where Senator Strom Thurmond essentially struck a deal with the New York delegation, basically to walk from any type of constitutional amendment around direct election.
Our framers did make the Constitution somewhat hard to change. They didn't want a simple transient, even majority to be able to change the Constitution. Instead, it requires a significant vote in the House and Senate, and then it requires ratification of 3/4 of the states. That's designed to stop the passions of the moment from changing the rules to benefit a particular side, and instead designed to force consensus.
The possible ways of changing the electoral system, one would be actually to change the Constitution, and it would be very difficult to get this through Congress, given the fact that you have battleground states that receive a lot of attention and money just because of the winner-take-all rule and the fact that they are battleground states. Another method would be to say that we're going to apportion all of our electors by congressional district. The challenge with that is that each state has to do that. The third would be to have agreements among states in terms of how they allocate electors. So you keep the Electoral College, it's the states that are deciding how the system is going to work, and there is a way to do that, to where you end up with every vote being equal.
I think we can get to the result of a national popular vote through a national popular vote interstate compact, like what's on the table here in Colorado.
The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is a contract between states that says once enough states join to have 270 electoral votes, the number needed to win the presidency, all the states will assign their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. It's a winner-take-all system, but one that reflects the national popular vote instead of just their statewide vote.
It's actually a way for states around the country to use the power that's granted to them through the United States Constitution in a way to allocate electors as they see fit.
In 2006, the Colorado State Senate, that had a Democratic majority, passed legislation that would allow a national popular vote compact. In 2009, it was the State House, another Democratic majority, that passed a legislation to have the national popular vote compact. And in 2017, it was introduced again. It's been introduced several times and has not passed.
It's a pretty big idea, and it takes some time for people to wrap their heads around it, to really understand what it does, and just as importantly, what it doesn't do.
The National Popular Vote Compact stands the notion of a federal republic completely on its head. It makes us a popular democracy.
That's a common mistake people make. They think that this is going to change the nature of our republic, and it doesn't do anything along those lines. The nature of a republic is that you elect people to represent you, whether it be through the legislature, through city councils, county commissions, or the presidency.
State legislature is where the power is. It's the state house and the state senate both. And, you know, when you stop to think about it, those are folks that are really very close to you. They're maybe beyond your neighborhood, but they're probably in your county or in your rural area. I can email my state legislators, senator and House member. I can call them and I can go visit them. And I should do all three and make sure that they know how I feel about voting for legislation.
Well, my opposition to the National Popular Vote Compact is one of long standing. The framers of the Constitution debated this question of should the president be popularly elected. That was one of the ideas on the table in 1787. But the concern was that more populous states would have greater power. They recognized in 1787 that there were strong regional interests, that the interests of Virginia were very different than the interests of Pennsylvania or Massachusetts or New York, which was the other powerhouse. There are those of us who believe that it raises constitutional issues and perhaps even sets us up for a constitutional crisis.
U.S. Supreme Court precedent makes clear that if it's a state issue and it's not taking away power from the federal government, that there needs to be no congressional approval. There are over 200 compacts in effect right now between states that have not had congressional approval. So this would be just one of those.
If you value the fact that we are a federal republic, then I do implore you vote no.
Why do we want to make a current system that I think represents rural parts of the country well? Why do we want to give that up to those in the more populated areas?
To devolve us into a mob rule democracy, which I believe this bill in the end would move us toward, is inappropriate.
We are about to declare that democracy trumps our federal representative republic.
It tears up the Constitution of the United States is what it does. It places it on the ash heap of history.
But we are now saying all of your electors, all of your representation in the federal race now have nothing to do with your land and everything to do with how a majority of the rest of America votes. And colleagues, that's not what I love about Colorado. I don't think it's what you love about Colorado. We love this fierce, independent, we're gonna do things our own way, whether the rest of the nation likes it or not.
Even if 10,000 of them send you an email and say, pass national popular vote, I suggest to you, you should not do so.
This is the will of the people in my district. They've made it very clear, and I actually listen to that. I take it extremely seriously.
Throughout the course of human history, if you have been on the side of greater democracy, you have almost always been on the right side.
The Federalists for us flags that perhaps we should not trust the ability of the average citizen to be able to resist being corrupted or being ignorant and casting an incorrect vote. And therefore, we should give that power to an uncorruptible few. I believe that the voters are capable, and therefore I ask for your aye vote on this bill. Thank you.
For those of you who haven't read Federalist 68, it was written by Alexander Hamilton, and I know that a lot of people have been talking about ALEXANDER for a little while. And I had several constituents that said, you know, Jonathan, if we do this, Representative Singer, if we pass Senate Bill 42, you're going to be throwing away your vote. And I just want to say, I'm not throwing away my vote. I'm not throwing away my vote. I'm just like my district, chill, scrappy, and optimistic, and I'm not throwing away my vote. So today, I'm rolling with Sirota because she wants to stand with every voter. And if you aren't, it's time you listen to Arndt and Foote. You know the Electoral College has almost gone kaput, so I'm not throwing away my vote. So before this is all said and through, I encourage an aye vote on Senate Bill 42.
With 19 ayes, 16 noes, 0 absent, 0 excused, Senate Bill 42 is passed. Co-sponsors.